sloucher is going to be accompanied by Marley, who's singing a song which many of you will know, but with words that he's written for his grandfather. I know everyone believes that their dad is the best, but I've always been certain that my dad was the best of people. Sorry. In our house, he wasn't in charge, Mum was definitely in charge. By the time Miley turned 10, Dad wasn't even second in command. But he played so many important roles in our family. Every day, I'd wake up to the sound of Dad going downstairs and his little knee clicking, because he went downstairs every morning and made everyone a cup of coffee while we all stayed in bed. And he would then bring it up on a tray and deliver it to all of us individually. so that we could drink them and prepare ourselves for the strain of actually getting out of bed and getting ready for school. He also drove the three of us every night. It was really rare for us to take public transport because he would go out of his way to drive us. He took us to school and back every day, and he rearranged his surgery so that it didn't clash with school times, even though it was in the opposite direction to school. So what should have been a 15-minute journey took him about an hour. Even when we reached the age when we would go out to pubs and clubs, he would come in the morning and pick us up from outside various Birmingham establishments. And I think the extreme was when I was at university in Manchester. One evening, he drove Pudman and two of his friends up from Birmingham, just so that they could go to a Britney Spears concert. Dad loved his friends and family, and we always had people coming round to our house throughout the weeks, and especially on weekends. And we'd usually be able to cater for them because Dad had a macro card and he would go to macro pretty much every week and stock our house like it was a corner shop. We'd have pallets of Coke, we'd have these massive boxes of crisps that you'd get from like Costco, and he also bought us all these Sara Lee Gatex. Obviously, being three cheeky kids, in between people coming around, we would make the most of it. And there was a period where I think Pudman and I only drank Coke, and he would threaten to stop buying Coke, and then we drank nothing, and so he'd have to start again. And he also showcased his cooking skills when people came around. His speciality was deviled prawns, which we'd eat with those 1970s cocktail forks, which we still got. And later on, more recently, when he was able to take control of the house and was a decision maker, he'd call us to say, on a weekend we want to make squid curry. And so we would all chip in various curries so that we could have this massive meal. But Dad was also really religious, the rest of us less so. And on Sundays, he would take himself off to temple every week. And he'd come back a couple of hours later with the most important thing, a copy of the Sunday Times. And he would also get us all sweets so that we could spend the next couple of hours dividing and rotating the Sunday Times over coffee and chocolates. He also took faith-based trips both to Sri Lanka and India. I'm really glad that when we were at school, he did make us go on one of those. We went to Tirupati together. But he went on lots alone. And on one of the trips to India, he found this sculpture of the Lord Krishna. And he painstakingly brought it home on the plane, carried it on his lap, and he displayed it on our grand piano. I think if people have come to our house in Birmingham, they know that we have quite a long loud, and at the end we have this really beautiful Beck-style piano from the 1800s. And whilst neither and I used that, because we learned the piano, it also turned out that he made a really nice goal for indoor football that Pudman used quite a lot with our friends, and which Mum and Dad, because they were always indulgent towards their little prince, let go, didn't have a problem with. Sadly for Lord Krishna, about a week into being in Birmingham, Pudman had smashed a shot at the piano, slightly missed, and took Lord Krishna's head off on some reason, which really devastated Dad. No punishment, and luckily one of his friends, Uncle Jamie, was around and managed to glue Krishna back together again. And he still remains with us. He was on the piano still, probably nervously watching as Pudman and lots of good boys peppered shots at the piano over the years. But he successfully did make the move to London with Mum and Dad. And he's in our dining room that nobody goes and leaves everything by staying for a long time. As you all know, our family life was reshaped when Mum was diagnosed with Parkinson's, when the three of us were still in junior school. And at the time, early onset Parkinson's was really rare. Mum was completely unknown, so it was pretty devastating turn of events for them as young parents. Whilst Mum turned out to be absolutely superhuman, and she continued to work and take her commitments really seriously for as long as possible, after a few years, she was forced to give up work and driving, which left Dad to pretty much carry the financial and operational burdens of the young family on his own. He did that without complaint, fuss, or us noticing any change to our lives. We never had to sacrifice anything. Later, as Mum's Parkinson's progressed, Dad became her primary carer, and they made the decision to move to London to be nearer to us. It's largely because of him that she's been able to remain so independent and in their own home together, with the support of Mum's fantastic carers, some of whom are here today, and who also looked after Dad as well as Mum so well. I can't talk about Dad without mentioning his sense of humour. He had close relationships with many people, especially children, and all of his nieces and nephews and our family friends' kids. For some reason, children and babies gravitate towards Dad. We always joke with him that it's because he looks like a massive baby, so he thinks he's a winner. But to be fair to him, those relationships continued as those kids grew up. His sense of humour is really something that everyone bonded with over. And whilst Dad was always making jokes, he was always on the look for the next subjects for his observational comedy, which he excelled, or not, depending on your own sense of humour. Some of you will have heard some of Dad's stories, which were often based on fairly ordinary occurrences, but which he would tell in the most dramatic way, including impressions, and always with a memorable catchphrase. And he found them so funny himself that he would continue to tell these stories over the years, and for the rest of his life to everybody, just kept adding to the repertoire as his life went on. Dad worked as a doctor. He was a GP in Birmingham for many years, and was really devoted to his colleagues and patients. We were really touched by the many messages that we've received from people connected with his surgery, who have told how Dad went over and above in caring for his community and the difference that he made to people's lives. We didn't really see what he did at work, but I never thought he did very much, as every ailment I've ever complained of as a child was always diagnosed as growing pains, without any medical examination, and I'm 5'4". However, every December, he'd start coming home every day with a huge bag of Christmas presents for himself, mostly ties and bottles of red wine, so clearly his patients knew him well. And when he retired, we were taken aback by the river of cards that he received. Each one had a detailed message explaining what he'd done for a particular patient and how much he was valued. I remember being really surprised, but then remembering that he would give our home number to patients who were going through difficult times so that he could call them at any time. And if he got calls in the middle of the night, he would get up and go to his patients no matter what he had going on. He was also really lucky to have worked with a group of really wonderful colleagues at the surgery who became really good friends and an extension of family to him, and he was kept in touch with since his retirement. Dad's a really soft man. As kids, we were very superficial, brought into all the TV advertising and constantly asking for the latest toys. Knowing that he wasn't in charge in our house, he would always say, "Ask your mother," which never worked out well because Mum always said no, because she could. So we'd always be disappointed and think that was that. Except a few days later, he'd come home and he'd pretend that he needed something unloaded from the boot, so we'd kind of trot out, and inevitably we'd find the toys that we'd been asking for the other day, which he bought despite knowing that he would get told off by Mum for undermining her authority. After I left university, I actually moved back and lived with Dad, Mum, and my grandma for a couple of years. I left without applying for any jobs because I hadn't enjoyed my degree and was a bit directionless at the time. So you would have thought that it would be quite a difficult period in my life. However, when I look back, I remember it some of the best times. I really enjoyed being treated as an only child for a while. And we had so much fun going out to the latest restaurants in Birmingham. We hung out with Mum's friends, went to shows together, and we made lots of memories. Like when I was a kid, we had a special morning routine, which did still include Dad making me and Mum coffee in the morning. But we did come down and have breakfast together, and we especially used to do lots of cooking together. We had an obsession with chocolate-covered flapjacks that Mum really liked, and then chili paneer, which we'd had in some restaurant in Birmingham, and then made at least once a week, until the point that Dad said he couldn't eat paneer ever again, and he had refused to eat paneer for the rest of his life. Whilst I was in Birmingham, I did eventually get a job in an office that Dad dropped me to each morning. even though it was in the centre of town, so a 20-minute drive into town, and then he had to go back past home 20 minutes in the other direction. I never asked him to do this. I managed to get myself home every day, but he insisted on taking me in the morning. One thing that happened when I was working there was I have a thing about switching off electric appliances and then replaying that in my head. I need to know that I switched it off, otherwise I feel like something bad will happen. And in the office, the heating wasn't great, so in winter we had this electric heater, and I used it during the day, came home and couldn't remember whether I had switched it off or not. And I was really panicking that this heater would catch fire, set the office on fire. It was all paper-based stuff and it would burn down and I'd go to prison and also get sacked. And so, to the point when nobody could relax that night. So around midnight, nobody having got any sleep, Dad just said he'd drive me to the office to go and check whether it was still there. And he wasn't angry or annoyed about this, we just went. And it was locked up, so we couldn't even go inside. So we just sat outside for about half an hour, and we were just looking to see whether there was a fire or any evidence that a fire might be breaking out. And then Dad did what he probably could have done at home, which was explain to me that the sort of electrical appliances had fail-safes for this, because often people would leave them on for too long, and that probably, if I hadn't have turned the heater off, it would have had a safety mechanism that would have auto shut it off. Because obviously everything was fine about 7 hours later. As much as he did spoil us, we were also very skilled at pushing his buttons from time to time, which was always quite comical because Dad couldn't really handle being angry very well because it wasn't really his nature. One time, Parliament did something that made him so angry that he was completely lost for words. And instead of shouting, we watched as Dad took Parliament's most prized possession, which was a VHS video of the Italia 90 Football World Cup out of the cupboard, and stamped on it and kept shouting to Parliament's utter devastation. I think Dad probably really regretted that action as much as Puddy did, because we watched that video all the time, and Dad was also a huge football fan. As a family, we're mostly Manchester United supporters, and Dad is a huge and keen one, although he does always retain a soft spot for Birmingham City. Weekends, if you go to Mum and Dad's, it involves watching a continual series of football-related programmes and televised matches. Although I have to say, watching Manchester United with Dad is an absolute nightmare. If we're winning, it's all right, but as soon as the opposition get the ball, it starts in this stream of negative consciousness, always focused on how we're about to lose, how they're about to score, and how stupid our players were, which has made the last 10 years, at least, of watching Manchester United quite agonising. Dad really loved to travel. When we were younger, our trips mostly focused on visiting family and friends. But when he retired, he and Mum were lucky to go on a number of exotic trips with their batchmates. And I know that he really loved those and always talked about where he was going to go next. Sadly, as their health deteriorated, they were unable to continue to explore the world. So I think instead, in the last few years, his grandchildren have been the source of the most happiness for him. As a family, we always gather at their house every Sunday for dinner. I always get there first, and Dad, who obviously likes routines, will ask me every day if each one of them is coming by name, even though he knows we're all coming. He's always very impatient if they're running late. He's clock watching until they get there. And he always wants to know all of their news, from their football and rugby results to their musical and academic achievements. They have their own set of in-jokes, and despite his declining health, the kids have really adapted to keeping close to him and hanging out with him in his special chair. I think we all feel really lucky to have been able to spend the last few years seeing Dad so regularly. It has been difficult to see him starting to struggle with his mobility and losing some of his verve for life. But despite that, he's always offered us a bit of sparkle every time we see him. And given the last month of his life was particularly difficult, I'm glad that he's at peace now, having lived such a full life.
The measure of a man. Not how did he die, but how did he live. Not what did he gain, but what did he give. These are the units to measure the worth of a man as a man, regardless of birth. Not what was his station, but had he a heart? And how did he play his God-given part? Was he ever ready, with word of good cheer, to bring back a smile, or to banish a tear? Not what was his church, nor what was his creed, but had he befriended those really in need? Not what did the sketch in the newspaper say, but how many were sorry when he passed away. These are the things that measure the worth of a man as a man, regardless of birth. We're now going to have the committal of Upbar's body, and that's going to be accompanied a cappella, I believe, by Vela Palendrum, who is my mum's younger brother, who's going to be singing one of Dad's favourite songs, Pavare